Biltmore, fall is more than just the perfect time to experience the grace and grandeur of America's largest home. It's also the season to savor an award-winning selection from Biltmore's very own winery, then linger for an unforgettable evening of locally sourced seasonal cuisine, from simple and satisfying to fine four-star dining. Fall at Biltmore offers something for every taste. Stay and save up to 20% on select dates at Biltmore.com.
Hello and welcome to All Indians Matter. I am Ashraf Engineer. The growing awareness about inclusive policy making spans various spheres: economic, social, and everything in between. While we've had a lot of discussion about things like gender budgeting and women centric social programs, very few in India have even thought about gender and foreign policy. At the international level, however, several countries are gender mainstreaming their foreign policy, beginning with Sweden's adoption of a Feminist Foreign Policy or FFP in 2014. I recently came across a fascinating paper called Understanding the Feminist Foreign Policy, A View from India, and reached out to the Kubernein Initiative that had released it.
All Indians Matter.
I am very pleased to have on the show Priyanka Bhide, co-founder and director of the Kubernein Initiative, an independent female-led geopolitical think tank and advisory firm based in Mumbai. Kubernein is working to mainstream issues that need greater intellectual capacity and focus. Since 2019, Priyanka has co-led Kubernein's flagship program on gender and foreign policy. Priyanka comes from a strategy and communication background with over a decade of experience with the private and non-profit sectors. Welcome, Priyanka.
Hi, Ashraf. Happy to be here.
Priyanka, the report makes the point that women are almost always disproportionately affected by any major global problem. Could you explain that and maybe give an example of it?
Sure. So, essentially, the world that we live in is designed by men, and women have always played a supporting cast in it, right? So, these are our traditional structures that have been holding our world together for ages. And as a result of that, anything that happens anywhere in the world impacts women more, but also the marginalized. So when we talk about inclusivity and gender, we're actually taking that broader lens, because depending on who you are and where you are, you would be impacted more. And the example here, the biggest one is, of course, COVID, right? When COVID hit, the women, there were a larger section of women that lost their jobs, because the way the jobs are structured are also very masculine, right? So most of the women work in these unorganized sectors. I mean, the lower income women would work in unorganized sectors where they were house help, and those kind of women lost their jobs. But also then in the more organized spaces, the responsibility of some of the household work fell on them. And so then when the decision had to be made, it was usually the woman who gave up the job. Also because the way that salaries are structured for the same position, men are often paid far more than women. And the same, I mean, you take this away from the urban setting, you take it to a rural setting. In agriculture as well, a large part of the agrarian workforce is actually women, but women that are uneducated and do not have land rights. So when there's any kind of catastrophe, right, you call it, I mean, crops failing because of rain, unseasonal rain and climate change, it is those women that are impacted the most. Or if something happens where somebody has to go out of the village to seek employment, it's always the men that go out and the women that are left behind. And land rights are also very unequally distributed. Although by law women are allowed to inherit, in practice what that means is very different. So this is in a nutshell.
I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, one of the lasting impacts of the loss of jobs for women after COVID is that we still haven't gone back to pre-COVID women's participation in the labor force. I mean, the numbers are dismal. I don't have them ready at this point, but there's been enough media coverage about it. But Priyanka, in this context, everything that you just said, why is it important to link gender to foreign policy?
So it's important to link gender and inclusivity to any policy. We only began with foreign policy because when we got into this conversation of feminist foreign policy, it was something that was being looked at in the foreign policy area and in the global north, of course. And when we joined this conversation as an Indian organization, nobody was bringing in the perspective of the global south, right? So these countries were looking at inclusivity in very binary forms. So one of the things we try to do is to bring about this understanding of what it means from our part of the world, right? And I mean, we began with foreign policy also because that's where India has done a lot of work in terms of gender mainstreaming in the way that we've done our development partnerships. We've had gender considerations, although perhaps not by design, but they are there. If you see our engagements with other countries as well, they're very human rights centered. And so we connected into this conversation to say that it is not something that should be discussed only in the West. We are very well equipped to have this discussion and contribute to it as well. And then to start a conversation in India, right, where initially there was some amount of skepticism as to what is the word feminist is so Western, it doesn't translate in to the Indian context, does it make sense? But then we did a lot of decoding and conversations to understand that there was already a ground upon which we could build further. The hope is also that something that might start with foreign policy will then eventually percolate to all of our other policies, as it often does, right? Even the climate conversation started at a very international stage, but we see now how it's impacting everyone, right, at all levels. So that is the reasoning behind it and the story as well.
Right now in India, there's been little or no debate about gender focused foreign policy. You see that changing at all in recent times?
Mm, I would say, I mean, so one thing that we've done very consciously is to use the term inclusive, and we've not come to it in a light manner, right? We did a lot of consultations, closed door consultations to understand what terminology makes sense for our country. And so we've used the word inclusion. And you see that being used a lot in, the kind of government language, in the G20 language, the word inclusion is coming about a lot. We also see this change, and this is not I will not let Kubernein take all the credit, of course. There are several organizations around it, but this is a shift that we've seen from 2018-19 when we joined into the conversation, where even the government perspective on it, right? They are saying we've moved from women's development to women-led development. So these are subtle shifts which are very important when you measure this kind of impact, because this kind of impact you cannot measure very easily in numbers. It's anecdotal. You can also not connect it very in a very concrete manner to a particular organization or a particular person, right? But these are the shifts that we have definitely seen
Also, it
anecdotally.
plays out in the long run, right? It's not something immediate.
Exactly, it takes time. I mean, that's why they call it generation equality, right? We don't expect to make it there in one generation. It's going to take several generations to get that kind of equality that we aspire for.
Yeah, that's why it's important to start now. Priyanka, what would a feminist foreign policy or FFP look like in the Indian context?
Very difficult question, but what we have tried to, I mean, the way we've tried to approach it is that, see, it should be something that we chart out, right? That's the beauty of the concept, actually. The feminist foreign policy is an approach. And every country that has adopted it or is thinking about it or is even discussing it in the way that we are, right, in the spaces of civil society and think tanks, they're looking at where they could begin. So, given that, I think in India, we have a lot of laws and regulations that are in a sense neutral. They're gender neutral, right? But if you dig more deeply, they are gender blind. And what I mean by that, they do not take into account the differentiated impact that a policy might have on men versus women, on marginalized versus the wealthy, or even within one economic strata, women in different states face different challenges and obstacles, right? So I think for us to get to a point where we could announce such a policy, we'd have to do some of that work, like we see Mexico has done, right? Mexico and India has a very similar situation, and they have announced a feminist foreign policy as a aspirational step almost, right? Where they did some amount of work in terms of their foreign policy makeup, and they had a higher number of women ambassadors, and they did some amount of groundwork, and then they have announced this policy, which has also received some amount of criticism, but they're taking it as a way to kind of improve conditions for them as well. I feel that would be the way for India to do it, right? To take a few small steps while we make systemic changes internally to see how we can measure and then change the impact of our policies at various levels.
So, what are these steps, these small steps that India needs to take to make it happen?
Very fundamentally, I think we need to analyze a lot of what exists, right? Because we are so caught up in, okay, this policy is gender neutral. Nobody is looking into that kind of data, this gender disaggregated data, because when we measure, then we can actually see what the differences are, and then we can make those changes and tweaks to kind of overcome those barriers. So at some level, there is need for a lot more research and analysis. We still look to women's, to anything gender related as women's issues, right? That women are working on, or we are working on to improve the lives of women. We still have this very development focused lens, which is important. I'm not saying it's not important. But I think we need to shift that, to, if we really want to go towards this women-led development, what does that actually mean? What will it take? Right now, the way our society is structured, also, it's meant that, okay, we have these rules, and then the women have to make all sorts of sacrifices because they have these doors open, and then come to that level. But I think the generation before me has worked very hard to show that we are quite capable. So now we need to move towards a place where we are changing the rules a bit, right, and making the rules as well a bit equal as well.
So, let's get a little granular. If that were to happen, if India were to have a feminist foreign policy in place, what would be the benefits we would see on the ground?
We don't realize it often because we don't talk about foreign policy in whatever regular circles perhaps, but everything that happens within foreign policy now impacts us all, right, regardless of where we are. We may not have too much control over it because it's still a very top down approach that we have in India. Different countries have different approaches, but we have this top down approach. But what happens there affects us, right? So how, because we're now such a global uh, interconnected world, if you see again the COVID example, right, our relationships with other countries determine our ability to get access, right? Our relationships on trade will determine the kind of taxation impacts that businesses would have, the kind of openings that businesses would have to trade. And right now, the trading systems are also very, very male dominated systems, right? Our country, which is heavily dependent on MSMEs, the MSME sector is very heavily male dominated. There are very few women. Even if you see in the startup sector that's coming up, there are very few women in that sector. So if you take this feminist gender lens, I would imagine the policies would change in such a way that they would open more doors. They would make, they would create greater ease of access for not only women, but the idea is it should not be only for women. It should be for anyone in this marginalized group of people. I can give you a more concrete example if you
Yes,
want.
please. Yes, please.
It's a really silly example, but if you see the cost, and this is I cannot take the credit for it. Somebody brought it to my notice. But if you see the cost of a razor, right, a razor blade for men of a company, I've looked this up, is 25 rupees. But for women, something that's pink, this is a disposable razor, it's 69 rupees. right? For the color, what is it for? But very often, this tax shift is not only detrimental for the consumer, but also as a producer, because women will often be in these spaces where they're producing goods that are catered toward women, because again the jobs are the jobs are masculine and feminine still, right? There's that distinction. The way we are educated also has a lot of gender bias without we realizing it, and it's something I'm realizing every single day. I mean, I'm still learning.
Absolutely. I also wanted to underscore something that your report talks about, that many of those in charge close their minds the moment you use the word feminist. However, it's important to understand that a feminist foreign policy is about women having a voice, an agenda, and equal representation. And I don't think the people in charge can or should argue with that. What's your view?
I absolutely agree. We shouldn't argue, but I think the reason we hear that kind of reaction is one at one level, it's a very cultural reaction, right? Because the word feminist, it is so. I mean, you will not believe the kind of emotion I've seen when we put that word out. The other is because till people start actually talking about it and get involved in the conversation, the reaction is very defensive, because we do have the laws that are equal, right? So the reaction is very, but you have the access, you have that, what more do you need? So that's another reaction. So it takes time to have a conversation and say that no, we agree, like we agree it exists, but what more can we do, and what more can we do together, and how do we work together? So that is the shift that we are trying to bring about as well, right? And which is why for now, we are using in the Indian context as well inclusive and not feminist, because we think there's great value in the approach and the kind of things that other countries have even done with it. And if it's a matter of using a different word, it's fine, so long as the fundamental principles can be carried forward somehow.
So, since you mentioned other countries, which countries are leading the FFP charge and how have they benefited?
So the conversation started with Sweden. Sweden was the first country in 2014 to announce a feminist foreign policy. They have recently moved away from the word feminist, but if you see the way that they have structured it, a lot of their commitments and structures are in place, right? So in the West, it's been Sweden, Canada, France, Germany that first were the first ones there. But each country, if you observe, has taken a different route. So Canada has built on its feminist international assistance policy, right? They already had some amount of a gender component into it. They started from there. They now have free trade agreements with countries which have a gender chapter. So the Canada-Chile gender agreement, free trade agreement, has a gender chapter in it, right? Germany started it within their federal foreign office. So they again did not use the word feminist. They did gender mainstreaming within their federal foreign office, and then only recently, last year, announced a feminist foreign policy and then rules around it. France started with feminist diplomacy. Mexico was the first country from the global south to make such an announcement, and we've already covered that, so I won't repeat it. Then there are some countries that have made an intent to have a feminist foreign policy, so Chile and Libya amongst those, and others that while they they've not spelled out a gender mainstreaming policy or feminist foreign policy. If you observe what they've done within their foreign policy mechanisms, there's considerable evidence of gender mainstreaming. So that's where we see India could fall in and then build on. And the others in that space then would be Australia, Argentina, and there are several other countries that do this in various ways, either through their development assistance or those kind of partnerships. That's where they have begun.
So tell us about the evolution of FFP. When did the idea first come about? What is the journey it has traveled so far?
It's a journey that is still on. So I think it's still, which is why we find it so exciting, right? Because typically we've always had these concepts that began, outside in the West that have come to India. But this is actually a chance for us to shape what such a concept would mean. So in 2014, when Sweden announced this feminist foreign policy, and Margot Wallström was the person behind it, right, pushing it forward. They a lot of their work was on the women, peace, and security agenda, right? So they looked at it from a very from the peacemaking point of view. How do you get more women to decision making tables, in negotiating tables for peace agreements, and how then the outcomes could be better? And she looked at these three R's, right? Rights, representation, and resources, right? So you don't only give representation as a nominal thing, but you also you ensure that it comes with agency. So the people have rights to actually make decisions, and then the resources to support their work, right? So these are the three main things that she spoke about. But then, as that was a very it was based on their experience and their path. But each country has then, as I said earlier as well, has taken their own path and is still discovering. I mean, even a country like Canada is still working with the kind of feedback and the criticisms that they receive to evolve this concept, right? So is Germany. I mean, Germany is doing it in a very structured manner, which is, I think, very typical for Germany, right? And so, I mean, it's still evolving, and so this is the space for us to also be in. We should be talking about this, and there should be more organizations talking about this in India as well.
So I'm glad you mentioned the three R's, because I wanted, I actually want you to expand on that a little bit. Now, your report says, and I quote, "It is time we went beyond piecemeal efforts to create an environment that fosters diversity in thought and action, with policy outputs that strategically consider the impact on women and the marginalized. For this, we must go beyond the original three R's of rights, resources, and responsibility, and include components of research, reporting, reach, and resources." And a stop quote. Could you explain that?
The fundamental difference, right, between what can be achieved in the three R's in a Sweden, which cannot be achieved in India, is that it's very easy for not only India, for any country to kind of replicate the representation, right? And we've seen that in at the domestic level through the panchayat Raj. We have the quota system that exists, and the leaders that came in. It's taken several years for them to be trained to actually, from the point where they were elected as representatives, to be able to understand how to use that position and power to lead and govern. And still there are several places I know where it's still the woman is in power, but perhaps it's her husband or somebody within the family who's actually making the decision, right? So the similar situation should not occur again. To prevent that, we feel we should go in a more measured manner. So instead of having these large targets of just X number of women that are there, which is also a good way to do it, which needs to be accompanied by sufficient research to show where it needs to happen. There's some amount of research to show that, for example, in the diplomatic corps, traditionally women were given a certain type of soft role. They would be given the soft power roles and not the hard security roles. That is something that's changing, but the data is still kind of not very concrete. It's not there's no baseline data for a lot of these things for us to build upon. So in that sense, we need to do a lot more research on not only understanding where the women are, but also understanding then where they fall out, right? So we looked at the incoming batch of the IFS who would have joined services last year, and there's a remarkably high number of women in that batch. There was a class photo that we counted people off, and there were more than 44% of women in that picture. But clearly, somewhere the women are lost, right? And the same thing we see in our corporate sector as well, right? We have a lot of women graduates, a lot of women scientists also graduating, but then they somewhere along the line we lose them. So why do we lose them, right? We need a lot more research going into understanding why we lose them, and then what kind of policy change would be required to prevent that?
Now, we've established, of course, that India has a long way to go when it comes to a feminist foreign policy. We need to get the conversation started, in fact, more than anything else. Can India ever hope to lead that conversation?
I think we can if we are able to. I mean, in some ways, Kubernein has made a small start, but at the end of the day, we are outside of the government, so we need a little bit more official push. So, I mean, I think if somebody takes this forward, it's quite possible that we could lead the conversation for what it means from our perspective, right? Because if you just go by numbers, it's a very disheartening feeling every time you see these, the women empowerment numbers or gender gap numbers. They are very disheartening, and but rather than coming from a place of shame, I think if we could come from a place of confidence to own it and say that yes, this exists because of several historical and cultural reasons, and this is how we're going to come out of it. I think it would put us in a position of power, and I think that's the way we should be approaching it, and we could be leading the conversation here.
Yeah, absolutely. But have you actually consulted with or spoken to anybody in government about this?
Yes, so we have circulated our report very widely. Our original report on inclusive foreign policy was we did it in partnership with the India office of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and we have uh, circulated that within the MEA, the policy planning unit, and even within the way we've gone about our research has included a lot of consultations with former ambassadors. In our closed door conversations also, we have invited people from the government, whenever possible. So in that sense, we have created the awareness about it, and we also came out with a book of essays together with the Asia Foundation, where we had other organizations that are doing remarkable work on various areas of policy, like trade and climate. Those experts weigh in and take a gender lens. That report has also been widely circulated. That's the way to do it, I think, in India, because it's difficult to make a very tangible connection, as I have told you. But aware, we have created as much awareness as we possibly could.
So tell us more about the Kubernein Initiative and how is it participating in the push for an FFP?
So we are doing it in two ways. One is we are contributing to the global conversation through the think tank spaces, right? So we are part of the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative, which goes across geographies. We also consult regularly with organizations in Australia and in Canada, all around the world that are talking about this issue. Right? I recently even took part in a webinar on where they've International Feminista has released a report or critiquing the Mexico's feminist foreign policy. So we engage in these kind of dialogues that are happening outside of India to bring in the Indian perspective. But at the same time, we also push dialogue within India to develop the Indian perspective better. Because while we understand the international context quite well and the foreign policy at the core of it, we are not trained feminist IR scholars, and that there's a whole, in the theory of IR, there are people with PhDs in it. So our effort is also to connect some of that theoretical perspective, which is developing in India and growing. The number of IR programs in the country are also growing. So we have a lot of that theoretical thought coming out with the policy and practice sections of our country as well. So that's something that we're doing internally, and then we feed in a lot of that information externally as well.
Right, and IR is international relations. I just wanted to let our listeners know that. Right. So, Priyanka, here's a question I ask all my guests at the end of the show. Why do you do this work?
Why do I do this work?
It's normally the toughest question, as guests tell me. But
It is very tough. I do it for several reasons. I mean, one of the reasons, surprisingly, I mean, the reason I started Kubernein Initiative along with Ambika, and we both started for different reasons, right? My co-founder Ambika Vishwanath has been working in water security for a long time, and she wanted to kind of be in Mumbai but work in a think tank space, which is very Delhi focused. And I wanted to continue working in that space, but also wanted some amount of flexibility because of various family constraints. So, in that sense, in terms of like organizational structure, we wanted to create something that gives people flexibility to live lives alongside. And in that, and so the feminist foreign policy conversation just fits in so well, right, with what we are trying to do, because this is a conversation where people are trying to change the rules that have not been helpful for our planet, for the earth, for countries, the way we've been doing things. If we go along that road, we are going to kill our planet before an asteroid hits it. So, in that sense, it was a great it's a great place for me to be in, because it kind of helps me bring the kind of emotional place that I'm in my life to my work and combine the two. It's great. And maybe I'm a little crazy.
I think that aren't we all, isn't it? And that's the only way to get anything done. But Priyanka, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show and telling us why India needs a feminist foreign policy.
Thank you, Ashraf. If you would like to know more about us, we have a very active Twitter account, thanks to my wonderful colleague Aditi Mukund. It's at Kubernein. So you can follow everything that we do over there. And of course, we have a website, but nowadays people find it easier to follow Twitter. So wherever you find it helpful, we are also on LinkedIn.
Thank you all for listening. Please visit allindiansmatter.in, that's ALLINDIANSMATTER.in, for more columns and audio podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Ashraf Engineer, that's ASHRAFENGINER, and All Indians Count, that's ALLINDIANSCOUNT. Search for the All Indians Matter page on Facebook. On Instagram, the handle is All Indians Matter. Email me at editor@allindiansmatter.in. Catch you again soon.